October 17, 1893. The church bell in Black Hollow rang long after midnight, though no service had been called and no storm threatened the valley. By dawn, the townspeople would find their preacher lying face down in the frost behind the chapel he built with his own hands. Before the week was over, whispers of murder would divide neighbor from neighbor, and by winter, the truth would seem to vanish as completely as the mountain fog. More than a century later, the question still lingers in the hills of western Appalachia: who killed the Reverend Elijah Mercer, and why did an entire town appear to let the answer slip quietly into silence? Black Hollow was not marked on most maps in 1893. It was a narrow Appalachian settlement pressed between steep timbered ridges and a coal seam that had only recently drawn outside investors. The railroad stopped 6 miles away, leaving the hollow accessible only by wagon road and mule path. Isolation was not an inconvenience. It was a defining condition of life. The people of Black Hollow lived close to the land and closer to one another. Timber cutting in the spring, coal hauling in the summer, and harsh winters that sealed the valley in ice forged a culture built on endurance and suspicion of outsiders. News traveled by word of mouth. Justice, more often than not, was handled privately. Into this world came Reverend Elijah Mercer in the spring of 1887. He arrived with 2 trunks, a leather-bound Bible, and a letter of recommendation from a seminary in Lexington. He was 38 years old, educated, composed, and carried himself with a quiet authority that unsettled some and reassured others. Within a year, Mercer had organized the construction of a small white chapel near the creek bend. He preached temperance in a town where moonshine supplemented winter income. He spoke openly against gambling in a valley where card games often settled debts coal companies refused to acknowledge. And most notably, he kept meticulous written records. Those records would later become central to the mystery. To many in Black Hollow, Mercer was a stabilizing force. He officiated marriages, mediated land disputes, and wrote letters on behalf of miners injured in company shafts. He visited cabins where sickness lingered and sat beside men who feared the dark more than death. But not everyone welcomed his influence. By 1891, outside capital had begun purchasing mineral rights throughout the region. A wealthy family from Louisville, the Whitakers, quietly acquired hundreds of acres surrounding Black Hollow. Their representative, a sharply dressed agent named Thomas Bellamy, began surveying property lines that had never before been formally measured. The Hollow's residents, most of whom held land by handshake agreements and generational memory, grew uneasy. Reverend Mercer inserted himself into these negotiations. He reviewed contracts for miners who could not read. He questioned clauses that transferred timber rights without fair compensation. And according to several letters later found among his belongings, he warned that the Whitaker purchases threatened to displace entire families. It remains unclear whether Mercer's involvement was invited or self-appointed. What is clear is that his sermons began to change. Congregants later recalled sermons that spoke of wolves in tailored coats and silver coins that purchased silence. He never mentioned the Whitakers by name, but the implication did not go unnoticed. Attendance at services grew, but so did tension in the pews. In the summer of 1893, a fight broke out behind the general store between 2 miners over a land survey marker. Witnesses claimed that Bellamy himself had been present earlier that day, speaking privately with one of the men involved. Within weeks, 3 families received formal eviction notices. Mercer responded with a public meeting at the chapel. He read aloud sections of company contracts and argued that signatures obtained under threat were not binding before God or man. Some who attended described the gathering as hopeful. Others later called it reckless. By September, the preacher had begun keeping a second ledger separate from church records. No one knew of its existence until after his death. Its pages contained names, dates, and sums of money. Several entries referenced payments made to unnamed local intermediaries. What those payments represented has never been definitively established. On the evening of October 16, 1893, Mercer was seen leaving the cabin of widow Clara Hensley, whose late husband had died in a mining collapse 2 years prior. Clara would later testify that the Reverend appeared troubled and said only that he intended to set matters right before winter. At approximately 11 o'clock, a farmhand named Joseph Talbot claimed he heard raised voices near the chapel while returning from a neighboring ridge. He did not approach. In his later statement, Talbot said he recognized Mercer's voice but could not identify the other speaker. Shortly after midnight, the church bell rang. No one admitted to pulling the rope. At first light, a boy sent to fetch water found the preacher's body behind the chapel, partially concealed near the woodpile. There were signs of a struggle in the dirt. His coat was torn at the collar. A single blunt wound marked the back of his head. There was no firearm nearby, no knife, no obvious weapon left behind. Sheriff Alden Pike, whose jurisdiction technically extended to Black Hollow, though he resided 2 ridges over, arrived by late afternoon. His report described the death as suspicious, likely homicidal in nature. He noted boot prints near the scene, but made no plaster casts. Rain that evening erased much of what remained. The second ledger was not discovered until 2 days later, hidden beneath loose floorboards in Mercer's cabin. Sheriff Pike confiscated it, along with several letters addressed to individuals outside the valley. Those documents were never entered into official county record. What followed was less an investigation than a series of quiet conversations. Thomas Bellamy denied having seen Mercer that week. The Whitaker family issued a statement expressing sorrow and respect for the Reverend's community service. No formal charges were filed against any individual. Rumors, however, flourished. Some believed Mercer had uncovered evidence of bribery among local landholders acting as agents for the Whitakers. Others suggested he had been warned to abandon his inquiries and refused. A smaller faction whispered of a personal matter, a secret kept within the chapel walls. Clara Hensley's name surfaced repeatedly in private discussions, though no evidence linked her to violence. She left Black Hollow the following spring without explanation. By early 1894, winter had sealed the hollow in ice. Coal production continued. Evictions proceeded. And attendance at the chapel declined sharply. Without Mercer's steady presence, the building felt less like a sanctuary and more like a reminder. Sheriff Pike formally closed the case in February, citing insufficient evidence and lack of cooperative witnesses. Yet certain details resist easy dismissal. Several pages were torn from the second ledger before it was archived. The missing sections corresponded to dates in late September 1893. Additionally, an unsigned letter discovered decades later in a private Whitaker collection referenced the situation in Black Hollow having been resolved. Resolved in what sense remains uncertain. Local oral histories collected in the 1930s recount an elderly miner claiming that Mercer had intended to travel to Lexington with documents proving unlawful land seizures. According to this account, he never left the valley because he was intercepted. Others have questioned Sheriff Pike's neutrality. Court records indicate that his brother-in-law held a supply contract with the Whitaker mining operation. No direct evidence ties Pike to wrongdoing, but the relationship has fueled speculation. By the turn of the century, Black Hollow had changed. The original families were scattered. The chapel fell into disrepair before being dismantled for timber in 1912. New houses rose where old cabins once stood. And the story of the preacher became something spoken of only in lowered voices. In 1957, during road expansion through the valley, construction crews uncovered what appeared to be the rusted head of a mining hammer near the original chapel site. The tool bore faint staining and an initial carved into its handle, the letter B. Whether that initial stood for Bellamy, a miner named Barrett, or meant nothing at all has never been proven. The hammer was logged as an incidental find and later misplaced from county storage. To this day, no official record identifies a suspect in the death of Reverend Elijah Mercer. His grave, marked by a simple stone at the edge of what was once the churchyard, bears only his name and the year 1893. Some believe he was killed for daring to confront powerful interests that saw Black Hollow as a resource rather than a home. Others argue that the truth was smaller, more personal, and lost amid the larger struggle over land and money. What remains undeniable is the pattern that followed his death. The Whitaker holdings expanded unchallenged. Legal disputes dissolved. Those who had spoken most openly alongside Mercer either left the valley or withdrew from public life. Was the murder an act of calculated intimidation meant to silence dissent? Or was it the desperate act of a single individual fearing exposure? Why were key pages of the ledger removed? Why was physical evidence so carelessly handled? And who rang the church bell that night, if not the preacher himself? Black Hollow still exists, though the name appears on modern maps only as a minor geographic reference. The ridges remain steep. The creek still bends where the chapel once stood, and when autumn fog settles into the valley, it is not difficult to imagine the bell echoing through timber and coal dust. The forgotten murder of the preacher in Black Hollow is not merely a story of one man's death. It is a reflection of an era when power moved quietly through remote places, when justice could be shaped by wealth, and when silence was often mistaken for peace. Perhaps the truth was buried with the missing pages of a ledger. Perhaps it lies in a family archive never opened to public view. Or perhaps it lingers only in the memory of a valley that learned, on a cold October night in 1893, how easily a voice can be removed. What really happened behind that chapel after midnight? And if the answer were known, would it change anything now? The Hills have kept their secret for more than a century. Whether they will ever give it up remains uncertain. If you have encountered records, letters, or family accounts connected to Black Hollow, consider sharing them. Some stories fade with time. Others wait quietly for someone willing to ask the right questions. October 18th, 1893. By the second morning after the preacher's death, Black Hollow had already begun rewriting the story. Sheriff Alden Pike gathered a small circle of men inside the general store to take statements, though none were written in full. Each account seemed to shrink the night's events rather than clarify them. The raised voices Joseph Talbot claimed to hear were dismissed as wind through timber. The church bell, several insisted, must have loosened in the cold. No one admitted seeing a stranger on the road. It was as if the valley had agreed, without speaking, to soften the edges of what had happened. Yet beneath that quiet cooperation, tension pressed against the surface. The second ledger found beneath Mercer's floorboards was the only tangible thread pointing beyond a simple altercation. Its entries listed dates, land parcels, and unexplained payments marked with initials instead of names. Sheriff Pike announced publicly that the book contained nothing of criminal significance. Privately, however, he rode out to the Whitaker survey office 2 days later and remained there for nearly an hour. What was discussed has never been recorded. In the weeks that followed, small but telling changes unfolded. Thomas Bellamy postponed further eviction notices, claiming respect for the mourning period. 2 outspoken miners who had attended Mercer's final public meeting abruptly signed revised land agreements. Clara Hensley sold her cabin at a loss and left before the first snowfall. No indictments were issued. No coroner's inquest was formally convened. Some believed the absence of legal action proved there was no conspiracy at all. Appalachia in the 1890s was not unfamiliar with sudden violence. A dispute, a blow struck in anger, a body left in the dark. Such events, while tragic, were not unheard of. It remains possible that Reverend Mercer confronted the wrong man at the wrong hour, but others have questioned the pattern. Why were pages removed from the ledger before it reached county archives? Why did Sheriff Pike fail to preserve physical evidence at the scene? And why did economic negotiations in Black Hollow proceed so smoothly after the one man publicly challenging them was silenced? There are those who suggest Mercer intended to travel beyond the valley with proof of coercive land practices. Others believe he overestimated the protection his collar afforded him in a town where industry had begun to outweigh faith. It remains unclear whether his death was ordered, encouraged, or simply allowed. By winter's end, snow had covered the disturbed earth behind the chapel. The hollow returned to work. Timber fell. Coal moved. The bell rope was replaced, but it was rarely pulled. And in the absence of answers, silence settled more firmly than any verdict ever could. The forgotten murder of the preacher in Black Hollow endures not because of what is known, but because of what was never fully pursued. Somewhere between wealth and isolation, between conviction and fear, the truth slipped out of reach. Whether it was buried intentionally or simply left to fade may be the final question the valley refuses to answer.